Welcome back to another episode of Off Air. It's a brand new TV show where I and somebody very interesting, sometimes even maybe more interesting than me, have a conversation about what's going on in the world. And let me tell you, there is an awful lot going on in the world. This is, of course, Talk Radio on TV. My name is Mike Graham, and I'm joined today by Brendan O'Neill, the editor of Spiked Online. Brendan, very good afternoon to you.
How's it going, Mike?
Welcome to Talk Towers and the Talk Radio TV studios. You're about the seventh person I think we've done this with, and you know, every week when you think, well, we're not going to have that much to talk about this week, here we are smack bang in the middle of the Sandringham Summit. Even as we speak, the royal family are getting together to have what will be an incredible meeting. I mean, I would pay good money to be able to watch and listen to what they're about to be talking about.
Absolutely. I think it's going to be, whatever happens as a consequence of this, it's going to be really interesting.
It really is, yeah.
I think it's a real sign of the times. The whole thing is a sign of the times. You have this, the Harry and Meghan phenomenon, particularly led by Meghan herself, I think, where they want to break out, do their own thing, become more corporatist, more globalist, more narcissistic, more PC, more woke. And then you have the traditionalist royal family elements represented by the Queen saying, you know, not so fast. Hold on. There are traditions, there are rules, there are duties that you have to adhere to. So it's actually a very symbolic 21st century clash, I think, between the woke side and the traditional side.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, because people keep saying to me, well, it's not really a constitutional crisis, which is true because Harry's not close enough to the throne for it to be a constitutional problem. However, I don't think it's right to play down the constitutional effect of it, because we could be seeing the beginning of the end of what is the traditional royal family.
I think it's incredibly serious. I say this as someone actually who has very Republican tendencies. I've never been a very big fan of the monarchy, but at the same time, I think what Harry and Meghan are proposing is in some ways worse, because it's this retreat from responsibility and this sense that, you know, why on earth should we have any constraints in our lives at all? Why should we have the constraint of duty? Why should we have the constraint of family loyalty? Why shouldn't we just do whatever the hell we want to do? So it actually speaks very well to that kind of narcissistic moment, and this new generation, particularly the millennial generation, who think that everything should be about the self, the cult of the self, the celebration of the self. And I really think Meghan in particular, and Harry as well, reflect that culture particularly well, whereas the Queen reflects the entirely the opposite culture, which is the one of self-sacrifice, self-negation. You subsume yourself into tradition, duty, history. And so between the Queen versus Meghan Markle, within that clash, I think we're really seeing a real tussle of the values of our age.
Absolutely. And you wrote a great piece in The Spectator, which piqued my interest, in which you talked about people who are the somewheres versus the sort of nowheres, really. And I was thinking about that as we were preparing to do this show, because, you know, as you say, the Queen and Meghan Markle, you can tell by who's supporting whom how it kind of splits in society, like everything almost seems to do now. And all the same people who probably wanted to remain in the European Union, for example, are all kind of on Meghan Markle's side, saying, well, now you can see what power looks like, because they're now suggesting that Meghan Markle has the power and the Queen doesn't. Well, I don't think that's true. Yeah,
I think absolutely right. And the point I made in my piece is that the people who hate Brexit love Megxit. And that's because Megxit, you know, the removal of Harry and Meghan from the responsibility and tradition, is entirely in keeping with the chattering class view, and this view that, you know, the nation is out of date and
racist,
and
which
racist.
I find quite actually insulting as a citizen of this country. You know, I'm not racist. I don't know anyone who is racist. There are people who are racist in the country, but it is not a racist country.
I think you've really hit on the most important part of this whole discussion, which is this notion that any criticism of Meghan is racist, any criticism of Harry and Meghan is driven by racism, and this notion that's really come up over the past couple of weeks and past couple of days, in fact, that the nation itself is racist, and that's why we apparently couldn't take to this new royal woman, is completely and utterly untrue. And in fact, if you cast your minds back to when she first came around, there was a huge amount of positivity.
Yeah, of course.
During the wedding, there was a huge amount of positivity. 28 million people watched it. It was very positively covered on all the front pages of the newspapers. people only started to have a problem with Meghan Markle and Harry when they started to become really obnoxiously woke, very hectoring. They were flying around the world in private jets while at the same time lecturing people about their carbon footprint. Meghan Markle was using the pulpit of Vogue magazine to tell us all how we ought to be living. And people just said, hold on, we don't want our royals to dictate to us.
Right.
We want them to be symbolic, we want them to play a key role, we want them to be traditional and to tap us into history. But we don't want them to wag their fingers at us.
Yeah.
So that's the moment at which people said, okay, we're getting a bit tired of this Meghan Markle phenomenon. It had nothing whatsoever to do with racism. And I think that all this discussion now about how racist Britain is actually a new form of elitism itself, because it's basically these well-connected, often well-off, chattering class types looking down their noses at the nation, particularly at the kind of people who read tabloid newspapers, who they really loathe.
Well, I love
and
the fact that
calling us all racist.
Yeah, the New York Times and the Washington Post writing about how racist Britain is. Two newspapers which are situated in two of the most ghettoised cities in the world. And I lived in New York for 10 years, and I used to go to Washington all the time. I've never seen ghettos like that in any other part of the world. And the idea that we are racist and they're not somehow is ridiculous. You know, the people who are black in America have a much more difficult time getting anywhere than the people who are ethnically related to different races in this country, because we're a very much, I mean, one of the things you notice very much about London is how mixed it is. You know, when you go to any other country, you go to Spain, you go to France, you know, we are much more cosmopolitan and much more mixed as a population than most other cities in the world.
Absolutely right. And one of the things that concerns me most about this idea that Britain is a racist country is that it actually grates against the possibility of greater integration.
Yeah.
Because it sends this message constantly to migrant communities or to newly arriving migrants. It says to them, listen, guys, this is a really horrible country. It's full of racist scumbags. They probably hate you and everything that you represent. So watch yourself, be careful. And so that actually just grates against the thing that had been happening for the past few decades, which is more and more integration. And so I'm worried, and you mentioned the New York Times piece, that was written by Afua Hirsch, a Guardian writer, who had what can only be described as the most comfortable upper-class upbringing you could imagine. Private education, Oxford, straight into the broadcast media and then into a Guardian newspaper column, who then presumes to speak for all black people in Britain. And even though her experience is completely different to other black people's experience in this country, you know, my parents are immigrants. They came from Ireland, so I am a first-generation Briton.
Right.
And the thing that I'm interested in is the question of how immigrants can integrate, feel part of the nation. And this whole depressing, misanthropic discussion about the country being racist actually is a barrier to greater integration, and it does a real disservice to black people in this country.
Yeah, well, funnily enough, I talked to Dr. Rakib Hassan quite a lot from the Henry Jackson Society, and he's very interesting on this because he talks an awful lot about how, you know, the Labour Party in particular has this view that all people from sort of the Asian continent of Pakistan, Bangladesh and India and Sri Lanka are basically all Labour voting and basically all want to remain in the European Union. He said absolute rubbish. He said most of the guys that he hangs out with and that he knows in the Asian communities of Bedfordshire and Luton and places like that, they all want to keep immigrants out because they've been in Britain now for a long enough time to say, no, we've had enough of immigration. We actually want to we want to keep ourselves safe. We want to keep ourselves from inviting people from all over the world to just come and live here, and we want to put a stop to it. And many of them voted for Brexit, and that's not the narrative that we hear or see in most of the media. You know,
one of Rakib also writes for Spiked and writes very interestingly on questions of integration, questions related to Brexit, and the fact that, you know, a third of ethnic minorities voted for Brexit, and they get completely ignored in this discussion. And it's higher among Indian heritage immigrants who were very favourable towards Brexit. So it's a very complex picture. And the thing is that different communities integrate differently depending on the signals that society itself sends to them. So when society sends a signal like, you know, you'll do well, you will really benefit if you learn our language and take part in our traditions, then immigrants tend to integrate pretty well. But when society sends the message that this is a horrible society, it's full of racist scumbags, and life will be very difficult for you here, then people tend to say, well, what's the point of integrating? So the thing that worries me most about the Harry and Meghan discussion of the past couple of days is that it really reflects this depressing, inaccurate view of the nation as being full of prejudice, when in truth Britain is more open to immigration than many other European countries, is more open to having a mixed community than many other European countries, and is very enlightened in those areas. And this constant defamation of Britain as a racist country is bad for the people who live here, and it's bad for the people who aspire at some point to come here.
Yeah, no, absolutely right. And I mean, you talk as well about the wokeness of Harry and Meghan and this whole kind of mental health thing, which we seem to have been consumed by. You know, I remember when Prince William got married to Kate and they became the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge. She was seen very much as an outsider. You know, now she's very much not an outsider because she's actually conducted herself in the way that people would have expected her to do. Meghan Markle has come in and she's apparently kind of been a substitute mother for Harry because she started telling him that it was okay not to be okay.
Yeah.
And suddenly that's the new kind of watch phrase, isn't it? I mean, everybody's talking about how it's okay not to be okay. You can't bully anybody anymore. You can't shout at anybody. You can't be critical of anybody. You can't fat shame somebody. I mean, you hear some of the stuff you hear is quite... I mean, I literally am sort of falling about laughing half the time watching the way people are trying to describe whatever it is that's wrong with them, instead of just kind of getting on with it. And I mean, again, the media totally encourages that.
But you know, that's absolutely right. And what I think one of the key turning points, or one of the things that made me think, hold on, what's going on here, is when Meghan said that she had tried the stiff upper lip thing, which has traditionally been associated with royal life, and it didn't work for her, so she became so she just fell further into that kind of let it all hang out mental health nonsense. And so what you have is just this clash of values. You have the values of the royal family, which are quite stoic and self-contained and self-driven and not self-pitying at all, even though I actually think some royal people's lives are probably quite difficult, right? They can't do normal things.
I'm sure that's the case, but you know, there are compensations.
There are compensations. There are huge compensations. Palaces and wealth and privilege.
I discovered last week that at Frogmore Cottage alone, they have 6 people working there.
Yeah.
You know, 2 orderlies. I don't even know what an orderly does. A nanny, a housekeeper, and a couple of other people, I think a couple of maids or something. You just think, hang on a second, you've been telling Tom Bradby about how difficult it is being, you know, a new mother. You've got a nanny. You've got a nanny every time you turn around. You know, you've got people to do everything for you. You don't have to cook. You literally don't have to do anything. And yet you can't manage it.
I think that one of the key things that will have turned people off Meghan was when she started complaining about her life. And when she said, no one asks me if I'm okay. No one asks me, are you coping all right? And I think most ordinary people who often struggle to make ends meet, or for whom life is often quite difficult, will have thought to themselves, you know, pipe down. Your life is lovely. You're famous. You have a cottage, which is not a cottage. It's a mansion.
It's a 10-bedroom mansion.
Right. You live in the grounds of Windsor Castle. You fly around the world in private jets. You go to Elton John's house in the south of France. Stop.
You don't have to pay for anything. I mean, when was the last time she had to take
she doesn't
a
pay
credit
for
card
anything?
out and pay for something? You know, that trip they made to Australia, 81 grand that cost. You know, because they took so many people with them. And you know, at any point in time, she can turn around and go, "Can somebody get me a cheese sandwich?"
Absolutely right. She's worn garments which are worth more than many people earn in a year. And so, you know, British people don't take kindly to people complaining, especially if they've got nothing to complain about. So that's one of the key moments at which people thought, you know, we're getting sick of this Meghan Markle show now, actually, because you actually have this very nice life and you present yourself as the victim. And it really demonstrated how entrenched victim politics has become within the chattering classes, within the liberal elite, where even a princess, even a duchess, even someone who lives in the lap of luxury could present herself as a victim and expect sympathy. And that's the moment at which it broke down. And ordinary people said, no, we're not giving you our sympathy. And you have got to stop complaining. But she didn't.
Well, it reached kind of peak idiocy, didn't it? That famous day in the House of Commons when they were all shouting at each other and screeching at each other because Boris Johnson had said a word that they didn't like. And I mean, it's like ridiculous. You know,
Yeah.
I've had situations, and I'm not going to get into the detail of school scenarios, but, you know, there's a situation at a school that I know where somebody got into trouble for making fun of an underage girl who got pregnant. The underage girl who got pregnant didn't get into any trouble for getting pregnant, but the person who made fun of the girl who got pregnant was the one that got punished. And you suddenly go, well, hang on, there's something slightly round the wrong way about this, isn't there? So you're okay with that, but you're going to punish that person for saying something. And this is the whole kind of thought crime stuff now that we get into, right?
Complete thought crime, speech policing, Boris Johnson saying the word humbug because a Labour MP, Paula Sheriff, complained that his language, because he referred to the Brexit bill as the surrender bill.
That's right.
And she said, how can you use the word surrender? You're going to cause MPs to be killed. You're going to cause a rise in far-right violence.
I mean, the use of the Joe Cox murder has been quite shameful.
Absolutely, completely and utterly shameful, and basically exploiting a horrific murder to score political points, and exploiting a horrific murder in order to silence Boris Johnson in particular, but also other politicians too. It's the definition of cynicism, and of course the hilarious
thing. Don't you find
thing
as well that so many politicians now are completely and utterly wedded to this kind of bald-faced lying, which they never used to do, I don't think, as much as they do now. I mean, they did a bit of spin, and we all, know what Alistair Campbell was up to when he was in Downing Street with Tony Blair. But they now, like Corbyn and this whole business of Trump, buying the NHS, they knew that was a lie. They knew that it wasn't true, and yet they kept peddling it.
I do worry about politicians' relationship with the truth and the cavalier nature in which they will say things which they themselves must know is not true. Corbyn and the NHS is a very good example. I think that was a really good example of Corbyn being completely and utterly on the back foot by that point in the election campaign, because he knew he was going to lose, and all the polls suggested that working class areas were going to revolt against him, which thank God they did.
Yeah, really.
But so he was desperate, and so in this moment of desperation, he says Donald Trump is going to buy the NHS, and anyone who looked at that document, or anyone who read it in depth, or anyone who read it not even in depth, would have seen instantly that it was completely and utterly untrue. Right. There is no way that the NHS is going to be sold off. There is no way that the NHS is going to be privatised completely, although there already is privatisation in the NHS, largely thanks to the Labour Party and Tony Blair.
Right.
That's a very good example of where politicians, their key interest now, I think, is saying things that they think will connect with their core supporters, rather than things that are true and things that are actually beneficial for people to talk about.
I mean, I had an interesting conversation before the election with Laura Pidcock, right, who was banging on about food banks and the 14.5 million people living in poverty. And I said, it's not true.
No.
I said, there are simply not 14.5 million people living in poverty. The only reason that there are 14.5 million people counted as living in poverty is because we've now got something which doesn't actually measure poverty. We've got a relative poverty. And apparently you can still have a flat screen TV, you can still have Sky, you can still have a mobile phone, and you can be said to be living in poverty. I said, it's absolute rubbish. And she said, that's right-wing nonsense, was her response.
See, that's the thing that really, really irritates me, because it's so obviously nonsense, this idea that 14 million people live in poverty. And the question I always ask myself is, why is there this ever-expanding definition of poverty? Right. And the reason there is, it doesn't benefit working class people who actually bristle against being called poor.
Yeah.
I mean, my parents were working class, and anyone who called them poor or said, oh, you poor things, you're living in poverty, that would have horrified them, because it wasn't true, and they were very...
also, they're aspirational.
They're aspirational, and they were more than capable of providing for their family, more than capable of owning a house, thanks to Thatcher and the right to buy. But the point was that they would have bristled against being called poor or being looked down upon as charity cases. So it's not the
my parents were the same. They both came from Glasgow, working class backgrounds. They both had kind of middle class jobs in London by the end of it, but they never had a lot of money. And my father would never borrow money.
No.
That was his thing. He would never, because he saw that as a sign of weakness. To borrow money to buy something you can't afford, we're not doing it.
But in Ireland, when my parents grew up, in the west of Ireland, they didn't have food banks, but they had something called the St. Vincent de Paul charity, where you would go if you desperately needed food. And people were incredibly reluctant to go there. They would only go there if they were really, really desperate. So this is why I am quite sceptical of the food bank phenomenon.
I'm very sceptical.
Because I think it raises so many questions in my mind about why people are willing to go to food banks, what it says about the fraying of neighbourhood bonds and local bonds and the way in which people would have coped in the past. There are so many bigger questions. But I think, you know, Laura Pidcock and this whole poverty thing, the people who benefit from the redefinition of poverty so that it includes millions of people is actually the kind of middle-class political elite, because it allows them to say, well, we're going to look after you.
Yeah.
So I think one of the key points to get across, and this is why I really hate the idea that it's far right to critique these things, the point I would make is that it doesn't benefit working people and poor people to constantly define them as living in poverty and as being pathetic and as needing assistance from on high.
Right.
The only people it benefits are people like Laura Pidcock, who get this cheap thrill from the idea that they are looking after these people who can't look after themselves. And that's, I find that really obnoxious.
I think that's very true. And also some sections of the media, like the BBC, for example, who will go out and do documentaries on these terrible people living terrible lives and not having any education and having too many children, but almost as though it's all somebody else's fault, that it's not their fault. And I think that's another theme of mine, that in this sort of constructed society that we now have, nobody's responsible for anything anymore. You're expected to be looked after. You know, people come in and expect to be treated properly at work because they might be suffering from some kind of mental health issue. I mean, I actually saw a piece the other day, should you be allowed to have time off when you break up with your boyfriend or girlfriend because you might be under some kind of mental stress?
The whole cult of mental fragility, I think, is having a very destructive impact on community life in this country, because it's promoting the message that you aren't responsible for your own behaviour, that everyone is pathetic, no one can really look after themselves. But, you know, and I think some sections of society kind of play into that. And they think, well, I'll play the victim and therefore I'll get benefits or I'll get assistance or I'll get pity. But the positive thing is that the majority of people aren't interested in it.
No.
You know, the majority of working people, the majority of people who work hard...
Well, as we saw at the election, you know, the majority of people in this country wanted to put Boris Johnson into power to get something done. They didn't buy this narrative that, you know, we have to look after everybody who's not as well off as Boris Johnson. Yeah,
but that's the great thing about the Brexit Revolt and then the Boris Revolt, which is like the Brexit Revolt Part 2, is precisely that it is ordinary people saying, look, we're sick of the technocratic nanny state pro-EU political establishment whose whole idea is that they have to look after us, whose whole idea is that they have to make the political decisions because we are too sad and tragic and pathetic to make those decisions ourselves. This was ordinary people saying, no, we want to take back control. We want control over our own lives, we want control over our own communities, and we want control over the nation itself. So one of the most positive things about the Brexit and then the Boris Revolt is that you had these huge, vast numbers of ordinary people saying, we don't want to be dictated to, we don't want to be spoken down to, we will take responsibility.
Need a network and a framework of laws from the European Union to make Britain a better place, because we literally don't need them.
And so that assertiveness, which, you know, has a long tradition in English history and in British history more broadly, that assertiveness of the people against the establishment, that's the most thrilling thing about Brexit, I think. And it really undercuts the Laura Pidcock view or the Corbynista view. And in fact, I've spoken to lots of people who did campaigning during the election campaign in December. And one of the things that really turned off working class voters on the doorstep is when they'd have these middle class Labour canvassers, usually from London. They'd never been to Wrexham in their lives, and they went there for half a day. And they would knock on people's doors and say, isn't your community terrible? Aren't your schools terrible? Isn't this country going to
everybody a racist?
Shit? And it's really horrible. We'll fix it. And people reacted against that because they thought to themselves, well, our communities aren't that bad. In fact, we're doing all right. The nation is fine. Everyone isn't a racist. Everyone isn't a scumbag. We aren't seeing the return of fascism and all this other hysteria and catastrophism that the Corbynistas came out with. And so one of the things I think was very important about the Red Wall Labour seats when they revolted against Labour was they were just saying, look, we've got a bit of self-respect. We know how to look after ourselves. We know that our communities have some problems. We can do something about it. We don't need you, overly educated nanny statists to come in and tell us what we should be doing. So that assertion of community responsibility is something I think it's really worth clinging onto and pushing further.
Yeah, and I think the whole kind of Brexit stalemate that we saw for most of last year until the election actually happened was entirely down to those people in Parliament who kept repeating the same mantra.
Yeah.
We can't do this because
Yeah.
it's a really, really bad idea.
Yeah.
So despite the fact that everybody's voted for it, despite the fact that, you know, the majority of people in the country, even those who wanted to remain now say just get on with it, they're still going, no,
Yeah.
still not a very good idea. And you will still find people from the Labour Party, even now, talking about how, you know, they got it wrong on Brexit, but Brexit's still a bad idea.
Yeah.
And that they'd like Jess Phillips to rejoin the European Union if she ever gets into power, which thank God I don't think she ever will.
No, thank God. No, that they can't let it go. And you know, lots of people are now saying, let's move on as a nation. Even Boris has said this, and Keir Starmer and others have said it. I don't think we should move on so fast, because we do need to have a reckoning with what happened over the past 3.5 years, and what happened over the period.
We can't just forget that it happened.
No,
right?
we cannot forget that. We cannot forget the fact that the political establishment went mad. I mean, that's the only way to describe it. They went completely nuts.
Well, you've only got to look at Jolyon Maugham as an example of where it all went wrong. You know, this guy starts off the year by trying to block Brexit by legal means.
Yeah.
He ends the year by beating a fox to death in his back garden with a baseball bat. I mean, if that's not an allegory for Brexit and the Remainers, I don't know what is.
The symbolism is beautiful.
Isn't it?
I mean, it's beautiful. The meltdown that these people went through.
Yeah.
I mean, they really lost the plot.
Oh, yeah.
They went completely mental, and there's no other way to put it. And all of them did. All of them. You know, I would sometimes meet these people, or I would do media debates with them, and I remember thinking, you're unhinged.
Yeah.
I mean, you've lost it.
Yeah.
You know, they had this view that Britain was becoming the most foul place on earth. It was like the 1930s again.
Yeah.
Everyone who voted for Brexit is a far-right, Hitler-loving lunatic. I mean, they had this completely unhinged
Philip Pullman
view.
is still putting that out there regarding Meghan and Harry. You know, the idea that he calls it a foul country because apparently we are all racist. It kind of brings it all full circle. So now some of these people have been able to vent their spleen on the royal story.
That's absolutely right. And,
You know.
and that's an important point, because I think what it reflects is that the cult of Remainers, this kind of psychotic group of people who spent 3.5 years raging against the country, raging against democracy and raging against ordinary people, that was never really about the European Union. I mean, these people didn't talk about the European Union before the referendum.
I used to say this on the radio show. I don't remember anyone ever coming up to me in the street or in a pub and going, "Hey, Brendan, isn't it great that we're in the European Union?
Never.
Isn't it fantastic?"
Never.
Nobody ever said
they
that.
never walked through the streets waving the EU flag. They never painted their face in the EU flag. The reason they did that, the reason they've been doing that more recently, is not really because they love the European Union. I mean, who could love the European Union?
It's not very lovable.
It's not lovable at all, but it's because it's become its own cultural identity, and it's a way in which sections of the establishment can say, I'm part of the In Club.
Yes.
I'm a good person.
Well, Layla Moran sat in my tent of common sense down in Westminster and said to me that she felt European. And I said, well, you can't actually be European because it's not a nation. You can't get a European passport. And she said, yes, but it's how I feel in my heart.
It's the feeling.
And that was it. And
that's
she,
all that
in
matters.
that one phrase, was attempting to then belittle me because I didn't have that feeling in my heart. And I said, well, that's fine. You can have a feeling in your heart. But you can't make people feel like that.
No. And, you know, it's a long time coming, because George Orwell wrote about this in the 1930s. George Orwell wrote about the English intellectuals who loathe their own nation and prefer to be in the company of Europeans in France and Italy, because they saw them as more sophisticated, more
like Polly
cultured.
Toynbee with her place in Tuscany.
Polly Toynbee going to Tuscany and surrounded by these wonderful, interesting people, whereas in London or the UK, she's surrounded by these idiots in Wrexham and all these other Labour voters who are such a disappointment to her. So it's always been there. The snobs in this country have often expressed their snobbery by saying, well, the English masses are stupid and they've been corrupted by the tabloids, whereas Europe is full of wonderful intellectuals just like us. So it's always been there, and I think it's become more pronounced over the past 3 years. But I think it's so important that we don't just forget that happened. We don't just forget the things they said and the things they did and the contempt that they hurled upon ordinary people. It's so important that we analyse that and think about that and don't let it slide into history too fast.
I'm certainly going to be doing my part to remind them every single day that I can.
Good.
That you said that this would happen and it didn't.
Yeah.
You know, you said we'd have no medicine on February the 1st, that we would literally have... I said this to a Labour woman the other day, Annalise Dodds, because the Department of the Environment put out a statement saying that they were not going to change the rules around chlorinated chicken, that actually at the moment we're not allowed to import it, and that will remain the case. So there won't be any importation of chlorinated chicken after all. And she said, well, I'd like to see a guarantee. I said, well, it's the Department of the Environment saying it. What do you want? I want to see them making it law. Well, it is law. Well, I want to see something written down. And you're like, what's wrong with you? You know, they've said it's not happening.
Yeah.
You said it would happen.
Yeah.
Jeremy Corbyn spent the best part of 3 months telling everybody that's what would happen.
Yeah.
And it ain't happening.
Yeah.
So just get it through your head.
No, they have to be held to account. They have to be held to account. And the thing they most have to be held to account for is, as you describe it, is this whole, all these fearful things that they pushed. The project fear, the idea that we'd run out of medicine, we'd run out of food, chlorinated chicken would be everywhere, we'd have all this horrible stuff from America and we'd all be poisoned by American orange juice and American chicken.
Right.
And this, my favourite headline was the front page of the Evening Standard a year or so ago, which said, if we leave without a deal, there will be an outbreak of super gonorrhea. And it was just summed up the almost biblical insanity of these people, that there would be plagues and pestilence and hunger. They lost the plot to that extent. And I think people like you and others really do have to hold them to account and really do have to say to them, you said this would happen and it didn't. So just explain to us why it didn't happen.
Yeah.
And putting them on the spot
why you said it in the first place.
Yeah, and why you said it. And I think that's one of the, because not only are we moving forward as a nation in the sense that we, you know, the Red Wall voters revolted and voted for Boris. Boris now says Brexit's going to happen at the 31st of January. We're moving ahead as a nation, but part of the process of moving ahead has to be to say to those Remainers, why did you do those things? Why did you tell those lies? Why did you spread those myths? And do you not appreciate what a destructive impact that had? And I think if we can have that kind of reckoning, then we can genuinely move forward as a nation.
Yeah, I think that would be good. Brendan, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
He's Brendan O'Neill, I'm Mike Graham. That is Off Air. We'll be back next week.